Hi, everybody. Well, I got applause. I can leave now, like I did my deal. I'm a guru. Wow, my students told me I look smarter if I wear glasses, so I told them I need all the help I can get. So, unfortunately, I don't look any better. I want to talk about helping young athletes develop their mental games today. And Greg gave me some information about the audience, but I was kind of guessing, and I know we've got a mixed audience with a lot of different coaches at different levels and some team managers. So I don't have any great need to get through all my slides, or I might skip one here or there. We'll make these slides available for everybody at the end. That you can, the normal way you get them or whatever. I think they hold you hostage for an evaluation or something, but I won't go there. So again, I ask questions. I want to meet your needs, not my needs. And I took some guesses on what might interest you and got some help along the way. So let's talk about helping young athletes develop their mental games. It's in dark here, so you may not be able to see it. I'm at Michigan State University, the Institute for the Study of Youth Sports. So while I've worked a lot in elite sport over the years, the last 15 years I've been focusing much more on children in sport. And I don't see those two areas being that far apart, because the children, if they're good, become the elite ones. And the elite ones, what they do on Saturday or Sunday usually influences the kids one way or another. So to me, it's all connected as we go forward. If some people are interested, I threw some of our annual reports in from our institute. I've got some up here. You can grab those on the way out. So without further ado, what I want to talk about today is psychological skills training that I know that you've been doing here the last 10 or 15 years in Danish sport, different degrees with different sports as you go through. The way I see it is, how do we teach young athletes the mental skills needed for sporting success? That's how I got interested in sports psychology. I was a wrestler. I used to get a little nervous and wanted to figure out how not to. I was always, like I played a gridiron U.S. football, and I used to get frustrated because I knew the two guys in my position that I played ahead of, when they tried, were better than me. So I couldn't quite figure out, why didn't they either quit or try? Well, how come I was starting? Because I really tried. But I always just say, well, if these guys really tried, they probably could beat me out. But they don't seem to do it. And our teams were always about 500. And I think, going back now, I think we could do some things to get the team to come together. So psychological skills training refers to the systematic and consistent practice of mental or psychological skills for, a lot of times we'll talk about enhancing performance. Sometimes it's increasing enjoyment. Other times it's self-satisfaction. But I think the systematic and consistent. And I was trained as a coach and physical educator. So you could put in teaching jump shots is specific and systematic and consistent practice. So to me, mental skills aren't a whole lot different than our handball skills or volleyball skills or swimming skills. We have instruction, we practice them, and we go forward. The key is consistent and systematic. Hardest part with mental skills, be nice if the kid did it and their head got bigger, so you could say, it was working, but they look the same. So sometimes that's frustrating. The strength people, at least they get a short term. You pump iron, it pops up a little bit, goes down a few minutes later, but at least for short term. How do we help young players develop mentally beyond teaching specific mental skills? So teaching mental skills is a big part of what we do in our field. However, I think if we think broader, a lot of the best work in the world comes out of here in Europe, and especially with some Danish football clubs and the other, looking at academies, how do they create a culture? I do some consulting for a business group out of England, Lane 4, Adrian Morehouse, a former Olympic gold medalist, started the company with a friend of mine. And when he trained at California, Berkeley, there was a sign like, this environment is created to produce champions. It's inevitable. So you walk in and the environment kind of creates champions. And I think sometimes we forget that. But if you look at really good programs, it's not just that. You have good coaches, you have other things, but boy, that can really help you. You have a tradition, people kind of get the values when they come in, versus some of you may have taken over a club or a program that's in shambles. And that's always like, I got to paint the place and make it not look like a dump. I got to try to, change culture. Okay? How does coaching? We know, I was trained as a coach. Coaches were the most important person in my life. My dad died when I was young. Those coaches were there for me. So I've spent most of my career studying the influence of coaches. How can we help transfer lessons learned in sport to beyond sport? Okay, most kids are going to age out. Most are never going to be at the national teams. How can you make better citizens of Denmark from playing your sport? And I'll tell you right now, I've spent the last 10, 15 years working in that area. And one of the biggest drawbacks, I think, is I was a wrestler and I do a lot with wrestling. They think wrestling produces better people. I don't disagree with it, but wrestling didn't do it. It was the coaches and the environment of wrestling. And I go to the sailors. Oh, sailing creates better people. I go to the handball. Although we play, But then sometimes athletes end up in jail. Did they not go to practice? The best wrestler I ever had in my high school got sentenced for, to death for murder. Well, he must have missed the character lessons. So I think one of the things when we talk about that is, if we want kids to develop these skills, we need to be pretty intentional. A lot of research coming out now. We need to talk about how they could use them outside of sport. The real smart kid will make the link. But some of the kids in the middle, and some of the kids, a few bricks shy of a full load, they're going to need a lot more help to kind of move that along. Okay. All children are not the same. We all know that if we've had children or seen children or coached children. And I know in some of your curricular work that's come out recently, you've talked about this. Now, these ages will change a little depending on the source. But, below 6 is sort of early childhood. Then we have early to middle childhood, around 5 to 10. Late childhood, early adolescence, 11 to 13. I don't know why I have an S there. Middle to late adolescence, 14 to 18. And young adulthood, 19 to 24. We used to think of 18 in our country as sort of the cutoff for youth. A lot of literature coming out with the brain imaging stuff, showing a lot of your, kind of kids moving into senior, 19 to 23, 24, the brain isn't fully fused until like 23, 24. And it's one reason that age group engages in the highest risk behaviors, does some crazy stuff, okay? And it's not the cause, but it's sort of some of the background there. So one thing I think you might want to think about if you're working with elite, that this is still a developmental level. And how are we going to socialize those people into the elite teams? Maybe we need to have a little more structure, some other type of things. Okay, so that's sort of our sequence. Now, in any of those age groups I put up there, obviously there's physical characteristics that change over time. There's social characteristics. There's cognitive characteristics or thoughts. And there's psychological characteristics. So within any of those, we can have these dimensions. Now, one of the things that's a pain in the butt about it, you can have a kid that's physically, at 15, like be a man or be pretty mature, and psychologically kind of be way behind. Drives coaches nuts. Or you can have a kid that physically isn't there, but psychologically really gets it. Right? So that's one of the challenges, I think, as a coach trying to read your kids. in some ways, if you just kind of went and whatever age group you're working with, just kind of did a little assessment. If I rate all my kids, where are they? Psychologically, cognitively, physically, socially. And just kind of, okay, then where do we need to move them? Now, I just took this Lindsay Kipp, just in a book we did just on sports psych for young athletes, did a nice chapter where she talked about these age groups and just gave some of the kind of characteristics with some coaching tips. Ages 5 to 10, we're not going to deal with the under early childhood at this point, but ages 5 to 10 learn best with concise, concrete cues and goals. We've all seen it if we've all played soccer. You tell kids to spread out. It's a beehive. The balls, the honey, and the bees are all over. And soccer and basketball and a lot of those games, you're really telling kids to go to open space, kick the ball where nobody is. At that age group, that's like crazy. All right, so sometimes, really good youth coaches will, when spacing kids, okay, everybody line up. 1, 2, 3, 4. 4 giant steps. When we run down the field, I want everybody 4 giant steps away from everybody else. It's concrete. But you'll hear, volunteer coaches in our country say, well, you're spacing. Kids are looking up at the planets. It's a space. I saw Star Trek. So I think, really, sometimes if you find out who is the best in your sport, maybe at that age group level, and watch them and model them and get some of that in. They cannot comprehend hypotheticals. So we thought, hey, well, this team's going to do this. Great. And their kids will go, okay, I'm with you, yeah. They have no idea, other than they didn't get in trouble because their head shook. Okay, first half of the period, so 5 to 7 or 8, children have high perceived competence, not all, but many children, because they rely on simple accomplishments and effort. At those young ages, effort and ability, they can't distinguish between the two. If you're good, you must try hard, and if you try hard, you're good. They can't separate those out like we can as an adult. And they get a lot of parents, if your country's anything like ours, you got some crazy parents, okay? But most 8 and under, 10 and under, they're not as crazy yet. They're starting to get there, but they're not there yet. All right, so most parents aren't yelling at kids and that type of thing at their really young ages, so their competence tends to be pretty good. Second half of the period, peer and coach feedback becomes more important. Now, and you'll see that as they go up, with the youngest ages, parents, really important. They hit puberty, parents' IQ drops a lot of points. The kids don't listen to the parents as much. All right, in the later part of this stage, logical thought processes develop, but children are still restricted in their ability to engage in abstract thinking. Okay, so they're better, they can logically understand some things, but I thought this was a great example she gave. They tend to understand only what they've experienced. So I'm talking about what the other team's going to do, but they haven't done it. They're probably not going to get it well, versus, hey, let's go out, see this? This is what the other team's going to do, what we just did. You have more of a chance there. So one of the hard part with all this age stuff, it's usually not black or white, and there's sort of a gray area, and it's trying to come up with examples that the principal would lead you to adapt to the kid. And it'll take some trial and error. 11 to 14, good news is about 11, 12, they can differentiate effort and ability. So so in other words, I tried really hard, but I'm not really good at this. Or I'm really good at this, but I don't try much. They sort of get it. And who drives the coach nuts? Kid that's really good that doesn't try. Just gives you gray hairs. Okay? Tend to compare themselves to others, so remind them that there are multiple ways to be successful. Somebody once described this as who's the bigger, taller, faster stage. They're comparing all the time. Well, we know long term, comparing is pretty darn important in sport, but also improving relative to your own ability is a key characteristic that we want kids to have. So you probably need to be reminding them here. Hey, well, how'd you do on your individual? Okay, I know you won, but how did you do on what we were improving on? Hey, we won the game. Well, that's all well and good, but you know, we didn't do this. We didn't do this. Peer relationships are important, so provide time to be with teammates. Now, I used to do some work with swimming, and the good coaches would have the kids work really hard, but you know, in the intervals when they're resting, they mess around with them. They help have squirt the water, you know, and have kind of contests. And you know, teaching the kids that, hey, when we do this, we have to work hard, but when here, we can sort of play around a little bit. Or can you have times for kids to be with their friends in a game, in a fun game that builds a skill that you want for your sport? You know, kind of making it a little more fun and kid-friendly. Allow athletes to discuss game. I thought this was an interesting one I hadn't thought of before. You're going to talk about a game situation that you were in if it's a team sport. You have a discussion with the kids. Well, let's talk about that, and I want everybody to say a suggestion for how we could improve that, or you know, analyze that, or whatever you're doing with them. So that's a way they can get some of the affiliation, but they're also learning to take some responsibility. We'll talk about asking questions later, but you know, if I ask you a question, your interest in sort of what's going on right now really jumps up a notch, because it's like, oh, I got to own it. Oh, everybody's looking at me. So kind of doing those type of things. Obviously, puberty, early maturing girls at risk for dropout, right? Because girls usually mature quicker than boys. In many sports, girls have an advantage prior to puberty. Okay, they have changes in puberty that mechanically, like gymnasts and figure skaters, harder for them to do the triple jumps or whatever. So it doesn't mean that a maturing girl can't be a good athlete, but they might be struggling a little, or it was easier before. So we want to pay particular attention to boys and girls, but girls especially. And obviously puberty can be linked to emotional swings in both boys and girls, and we just need to be aware of that and kind of adjust our temperature gauge in terms of us getting hot. Okay, yeah, they're middle schoolers, and yeah, that's what they do. You know, and you know, there's a time for discipline, so I'm not saying it's laissez-faire, but there's like, okay, they're in middle school. Had a great coach once tell me, he was actually the head of the USA Wrestling. His nephew moved with him. His nephew was 15, and his nephew was really, really good. And he goes, you know, he could win the state championship. And you know, and Steve, the guy I'm talking about, was a former Olympian. And he goes, you know, but Troy, you know, he could win it now, and I could probably push him to do it, but he isn't ready yet. I got to wait till he catches up emotionally. He's physically there, but he's emotionally not there. So it always impressed me that he said, I got to let him grow into it, you know, as opposed to push through it. So that to me was really kind of recognizing where the kid is, what's maybe best in the kid's long-term interests going forward. Ages 14 to 18, complex view of self develops. Close friendships are an important source of self-esteem. So if you're in team sports, individual sports as well, cliques, you know, somebody's letting you know what's going on in social media on the team, who's excluded, who's not excluded. I mean, that's just part of kids' lives today. You don't want to be spying on them, but you probably should have some notion of what's going on. Reinforce the importance of fair play and good sportsmanship, because they're trying to impress their peers and doing other things. So really good time for us to kind of maybe remind them of the ethics, because they can stray a little from there. Ability to think abstractly allows one to emphasize self-evaluation. Probably doing a lot of our sports psych work in here. the upper end of the earlier ages, mental skills training. You can do it at any age, but probably here's the sweet spot, because somebody talks about they get 14 or 15, their executive suite develops more. Their thinking, their strategic skills, their planning skills are all sort of developing. So that's a spot there that you're going to do some stuff when they're younger. When they're youngest, to me, you do a lot of sports psych through good coaching. You know, fun and fundamentals. You talk about what they can do versus what they can't do. You know, nursery rhyme stuff. I think I can, I think I can, I know I can. So as a coach, I might do that. Hey, no, I once did a thing for gymnasts, and I thought they were going to be like 13, 14. I went in there, and they were like 7 and 8. And Dan's panicking. I go, okay, sports psych for 7 and 8-year-olds. So I brought like a model of a brain, and I said, anybody know what this is? And we talked about it, and does everybody have one? Yeah. And we kind of talked about it a while, and then I said, what's your brain do? Kind of bosses you around. So we kind of end up talking about this. And the big points I wanted there is, what's it like if you get in a car ride and everybody says how long it is and how terrible and how you don't want to do it? So all the kids had been there. What's it like if you get in the car with your friends and you're talking or you're listening to music? And I go, okay, when you're a gymnast, you can make your practices like a long car ride, or you can kind of start thinking more positively to get through it. So at the young ages, we can do stuff like that. A lot of coach controlled, environment controlled. As they get older, and we can do some concrete skills, but here we can do a lot more because they just have the capacity. We'll talk a little bit more about self-regulation later. If kids don't learn good self-regulation, that's when the soccer coach over here goes crazy because his star player got in jail last night for getting drunk at a bar. He makes bad decisions. I'm paying somebody in America $20 million in the NBA, and they go out and do dumb things. Okay, so self-regulation skills are really important. And for those kids that are lucky and talented enough to become elite athletes, they're especially important because in many ways they're a target. They're in the bar, somebody wants to pick on them. You know, there's all, I once talked to a very successful college athlete. I don't know if a girl likes me because she likes me or she likes me because I'm the star on the team. So a lot of stuff goes on that, that we might be able to help with if they have good self-regulation. Susceptible to social anxiety because they kind of cue into social cues more. What are my friends going to say? What's everybody thinking? Maximum benefits of mental skills training I already mentioned. Okay, some principles here. Children are not miniature adults. That's probably a principle. Okay, they look like miniature adults. I bet you I can find fields around here in football season and find kids with the same uniforms, not in the academy, that look the same. And it looked like we shrunk the ones from, the Saturday's game, but inside they're not. Development occurs physically, cognitively, socially, psychologically at different rates, even in the same kid. There's a great variability between youth within the same stages of development. Like in America, it's been around for years, but we have like the Little League World Series in baseball. And Little League goes up to 12. It's become very professionalized. It's on TV. Looks like, they have up close and personals on an 11-year-old. Of course, it's the biggest thing in your life. You're 11. But what's interesting about that, when we look at those things, it can get so blown out of proportion. And developmentally, you'll see the pitcher. Okay, and it's mostly boys. Girls play now some, but mostly boys. The pitcher has a mustache. He's about, he's 12 years old. He's about maybe 5'11". He's got some muscles. And you'll see another kid that isn't there yet. So we get all that variability that goes, and I guess I'll say this now because I don't want to forget later. in terms of athletic talent development, I think in our country, I don't know how it is here, I think a curse for a kid is to call them talented when they're young. Because if you're an early mature, there's only one way to go. And, you know, versus, you know, like labeling talented or gifted. Hey, you like this, it's fun. There's some research about kids that turn out to be really successful in all fields have a kind of, there's an entity view, you judge you're better than everybody else, or an incremental view, I want to get better every day. If you think of the best athletes in your sport, they probably take an incremental view. They aren't satisfied because they won and they didn't play a really good game. Okay? Excuse me. Okay. I'm going to switch to another topic, but I want to see if we have any questions here at this point. Any questions or thoughts or comments?
I have a question regarding the, say it takes a good people reader to understand at what rate or what is the maturity at the different social, cognitive, psychological levels. And as I see the body language can tell a lot about the psychological, that is the best cues or clues I can get, but the level of how to articulate themselves tells me both about the cognitive and to some degree about the psychological. But I find it very difficult, and those two, cognitive, psychological, they're so close together. And if you want to see at what rate they are, at what level they are, what do you look at?
Yeah, that's a great point. Not everybody's available to do this, but sometimes if you really want to get schooled, find some really good school teachers of kids of that age and ask them. They can give you, because they're a better expert than I am because they're there every day. But the other sometimes is to put kids in situations that you think might test them. So cognitively, maybe you go, okay, this level works, but I'm going to get a little more sophisticated or a little more abstract. And then I see what kids seem to have some light switching on and which don't. Now, again, that's from an efficiency point if you're running a practice.
But as a coach, it would be, well, from my side, it would be quite easy to set up the cognitive challenge because we're all analytical. We know, we read the book, we know the sport. About the psychological challenge.
Okay, actually, I'll give you an answer now, but I'll come back to that. I think, again, it's got to be the right age, but a tremendous amount of coaching. I actually get this from the business literature. They talk about support and challenge. And you're constantly balancing support and challenge. And it's not just, I do a thing with my coaching class where I have them take ages and they kind of do a graph, how much support versus challenge, whatever those are. But it's also not just the amount, it's also qualitatively challenging a 6-year-old is much different than challenging a 16-year-old. But that sometimes like, okay, can I challenge them? Challenge might be, I'm going to give them a little longer drill than I would normally give this age group and see how they do. Okay, I'm going to make it a little harder to score. You know, kind of the small-sided games. I'm going to just, challenge them there. I'll come back to this later because I actually think that's a huge, probably the last 10 years I've been thinking a lot about that. We're not letting kids fail enough. Parents are intervening, at least in our country. They're protecting their kids, and kids need to learn how to fail. And now, when I worked with tennis, I still work a lot with tennis, but at one time they talked about ideally in tennis, you'd win about 60 to 65% of your matches. Because that's enough where you have confidence, but that also means you're playing above your ability. And at that time, we had an awful lot of American kids not going to tournaments so they could protect their ranking. So they wouldn't go to a better tournament, they'd go to this one because they didn't want to hurt their ranking. And the national staff was going, okay, we're thinking 60, 65% when they're, 15, 16 there. So I think, like who you schedule, how often you schedule those type of things. I'll come back to that, so don't let me forget at the end if I haven't come back to it. Other questions? Let me shift then to an area that I'm doing some research on now with my graduate students. Most of my research ideas I get from people like you. I go out and listen to you and go, oh, that's interesting, I'll go study it. Because you're in the field, you're working with the athletes every day, and I want to know what problems you have. Then I can go solve them, or try to solve them. I had some coaches talk about this. They go, you know, these kids are a little different today. Now, they've been saying it since my generation, you know, with the Flintstones back millions of years ago. But, you know, kids are different with every kind of cohort group, but there's some things going on today that make them really different, right? They call it the net generation, the I generation, Generation Z. Those are kids born after 1996. If you were born after 1996, you're, you know, especially, and you're not in dirt poverty or something, you probably grew up with technology in your life from day one. Your mom or dad had an iPad taking a picture of you when you popped out. Okay, then you know, you're younger and you're sort of playing with it. you know, how many times do you see kids in the shopping cart in the store with their parents' phone? Like little, I mean, kids have grown up with this. That makes them amazing in some ways. You know, like people my age, I got a problem, I call my 12-year-old over to fix it. I mean, because they're so skilled with it. But it's got some anchors with it too, some things that get in the way. Researchers are discovering that so much exposure to technology, and I'll say technology, social media, et cetera, and the cultural changes that have come with it, okay? My generation, sometimes parents babysat with the TV. Now sometimes they're babysitting, you know, hey, I don't want to talk to my kids, so here, go play with the technology. Okay, it's having some effects on these kids. Now, I reviewed a lot of literature, you know, anything from library sciences with college students of this generation. What they do is they're really good at searching information, really good at searching, not good at judging quality. They're good at finding it, but not as good at judging quality. Harvard students, right, you know, one of the best universities in our country, the world, their paragraphs they write today are as good as ever before. The stories are lacking. Why? They do one paragraph and then they go off and multitask. They do another paragraph, they multitask. Well, the story, you need a theme that carries across. So there's literature like this. Shorter attention spans, less independent. Why would they be less independent? Any thoughts? Yeah, some of it's the internet, some of it's other cultural differences. Being, well, I won't say old, being chronologically gifted. I'm chronologically gifted. Means I got some gray hairs. When I was a kid, if my brother and I acted up at school, Mrs. Gould went there and said, what did the Gould boys do now? In America today, if kids act up at school, what do the parents say when they get to school, do you think? What did the school do to my child? So there's this like distrust of authority, and parents are overprotective, we're finding. So kids aren't, I work sometimes in tennis, and you'll see the parent like carrying the bag on the court. Some of the pros are saying, no, don't, the kid forgets their equipment, those type of things. So that's sort of one of the issues. Yes, sir?
Could it also be that having that they have this constant need of stimulation and entertainment, they don't learn to get bored, so they don't learn to entertain themselves, where they need to be independent to kind of invent things instead their parents, they take care of them?
Yeah, I think actually that's a great point you raised. that the constant stimulation, they haven't experienced boredom. You want to really drive a Generation Z kid crazy? Go sit on the log a half hour by the creek and do nothing. It's like, you know, like, wow, this is crazy. Okay, so yeah, and a lot of these factors sort of come together. Okay, are used to getting what they want without having to work hard. It's not that they're lazy, because actually they're quite motivated, but what happens is, if you think of, you know, technology, you press a button and, you know, the gaming, I mean, you get these wonderful things very quickly. Okay, again, I'm showing my age, but I remember in school, when I first started being a professor, I would handwrite the paper out and give it to the secretary who would type it on a typewriter. And then I'd wait 2 weeks for her to get it typed. And then I'd do an edit. Now you just, you know, you're on your computer doing it, edit. You know, you can talk and it writes for you. So it's a very different world there. Okay, they talk about difficulties distinguishing between relevant from irrelevant information, fewer abilities to park a certain chunk of information for later storage, more likely to multitask while online, constantly moving across platforms, high expectations for success, expect to find information they need quickly and with little effort. Well, I can't get this backhand. How come? I spent 10 minutes on it. You know, versus the 10,000 hour rule, or if you buy into that. Often feel that they're unique and fabulous. Because, again, some of this is parenting. Okay, my generation sometimes screwed up. We wanted, you know, build self-concept, be positive, be encouraging. But we forgot to tell everybody, to do that, you need to be sincere and contingent. So if you did a good job, I tell you, but you better have done a good job. I don't versus good job, good job, good job as you go forward. Now, they have some good things. Strong work ethic, determined in some ways, need instant gratification, get it when you want it, culture. We're seeing this in college teaching. A lot of kids are procrastinating, like on term papers and things like that. They wait to the end, and it's not because they just don't care, because they're used to going to their computer and, you know, downloading it and getting it quick, versus they hadn't had that experiences where you had to wait, and, you know, like I'm just updating our book. It amazes me, and again, I'm showing my age, but I just go to the library and get the journal article and I download it and it pops up. I used to remember waiting 2 weeks for interlibrary loan to hunt for it from another library. They didn't have the book in. I mean, it's amazingly good that way. Okay, we're actually doing a study now with tennis coaches and some sports science people that work a lot with this age group, and they're trying to verify some of those characteristics. The ones they've talked about are the attention span, just communicating with kids. One really good coach, we were talking earlier today, told me, I've learned that if I want to call my player, I have to text him first, because he won't answer the phone unless I text him to let him know to pick up the phone. I mean, it's just the way it is. But he goes, I figured that out. I text him to tell him I'm calling, so then he picks up. Okay? The other is, this guy's a really good coach. He says, I've got to be a lot better teacher. I got to get in there fast. I can't be telling old war stories about how I did it back in the day. I got to be brisk. I got to be efficient. Think of gaming. Think of things you think online. They're efficient. They're slick. They're in there. And in some ways, as our coach, we got to be able to go in there and do that quick, which may take some rethinking. I know I can teach that, but what's the quickest way I could teach it? What's the most efficient way? How could I go forward? Can I tie some technology in? A lot of coaches are saying they love video and you send it to them. They'll reflect more that way than they might in person. They need structure and boundaries sometimes, because They're used to more of a wide open thing. So if, like in college, if they're doing a paper, here's the components. Do this, do this, do this. Need clear ground rules up front. You may need to explain. I assume they would know. Now, here are the ground rules that we're going forward. Help them learn how to delay gratification. We were talking earlier today. This project fascinates me because it came from coaches, but I just see how college students have changed. And I've loved my career as a college teacher. And as I get older, I'm trying to sort out. I remember when I was a kid, like, the old professor or teacher would go, I went to school in a snowstorm and there are 8,000 miles from school and walk barefoot. And I go, okay, is that me now? I'm thinking about the good old days. So on one hand, there's a lot of amazing things today. And as you age through your coaching career, what are the values that I think are really there that will, Plato had them, Socrates had them, the coaches back in Greece had them, and we still need to keep those. And then how do I meet the kids where they are? So it goes back to support and challenge. I'm constantly thinking now about how do I connect with this generation? Colleges, we're seeing lectures, we're trying to go to shorter 15-minute unit lectures and then an activity. 15 minutes and an activity. 15 minutes and activity. Problem is, not all topics break into 15-minute chunks. So what you're trying to do, on one hand, you're trying to meet the kids where they are, understand how they're learning today, how they function, and at the same time, you're going to try to stretch them, build their attention span, build their delay of gratification. A real great selling point for sport, why we should have sport this day and age, we can teach the things that kids aren't learning through natural things anymore. Delay of gratification, working hard. There's a lot of things we can teach. But for us to do that, we got to hook the kid at the front end and then balance the support and challenge. And I'll tell you right now, we know the more the kid likes you, the more the kid respects you and has a good relationship with you, the more you can challenge the kid. If you really trust me, I can make you uncomfortable more than somebody you don't trust. So that's where coach relationship. Yes, sir.
It's just I'm not quite sure gratification. My English is a little rusty maybe, but can you explain gratification? What is that?
Yeah, like you do a certain maneuver in sailing, and I give you that attaboy or a reward right away,
Yeah.
versus we wait till the next day. So it's sort of like I got to be there giving you the M&M every time you do it right.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you for asking on that. Okay, so one of the things I really challenge you to do when you're thinking developmentally with your programs, what can I do to better understand where kids are today? My son is an entrepreneur, and sort of he works in the entertainment business in Beverly Hills, and he works with a kid that's in social media. And this kid is making, let's put 20 million a year in social media, making videos. And it's a big business. But it was funny because they did a thing for Google, and I was listening to him and the kid, the 20-year-old he represents, making this kind of money. And they were talking about Generation Z kids. Generation Z kids like experiences. They don't want to just to buy a product. They want to have an experience with it. What does that mean when we hold a tournament? Normally, okay, there's a tournament, we keep score. Can we make it more of an experience if we're going to try to get kids interested in our sport? So they're selling product. They have these pop-up shops. They go into a country and they'll have a pop-up shop and an event. The kids come and they're selling product. Kids like stuff individualized today, and they can get some of that on the internet. Is there a way? U.S. Tennis is rebranding, and they're calling it the net generation. And they're rebranding so kids can have options. Like even when they're teaching them online, they can pick the color of the tennis ball or whatever. So they're really trying to tie into that. So the more you can learn about that to connect to kids. Now, then the other is we're building the trust, we're sort of hooking them in, and they're teaching us a lot of good stuff. And on the flip side of it, as I build their trust, I'm starting to challenge them. I'm trying to take them out of their comfort zone to learn the things that they need to learn that they may not necessarily know they need to learn to be successful. Okay, so that's, like delay of gratification. Tell me an Olympic champion that doesn't know how to delay gratification. Well, you got to wait 4 years to get it. You can be the best one in the world, but you got to train for 4 years. And that's probably unrealistic. You're probably training for 8 to 10 to get ready. Okay. Your perspective really quick. I want to hear from you. I've done enough talking. What age groups are you working with? So help me here. What do you want to get out of this? What age groups are you trying to figure out? Some of us look in the mirror and go, I'm trying to figure out that age group, but
17 and higher in my case.
okay, 17 and higher, so the young adult. Okay?
Well, I could go up to
Yeah.
something.
No, but young adult all the way up to the highest level, okay? Other age groups,
15 to 23.
15 to 23,
15 to 19.
15 to 19. Anybody working with the younger ends?
Well, we have them from 13.
13? Okay.
6 to about 18.
6 to 18, so the full range. And a lot of our sports, Bali's work and others, the kind of the progressive sort of models that people have built. Like, okay, the kid starts active lifestyle, fun and fundamentals, learn to train, train to train, train to win. Or if they aren't blessed with the right genes or motivation, healthy lifestyle. Because that's the other thing, like sometimes we get so competitive. One of our goals is to have healthy people. So not every kid's going to make it. I'll give you a great story a friend of mine told me down in Raleigh, North Carolina. Sad story, a youth swim coach had summer swim club, not year-round. Very good swimmer, but very good coach. Unfortunately died, had a life-threatening disease, and it came on really quick. He died like at 50. They figured this out, this came real quick, and they had 245 kids show up at his hospital room in a 24-hour period towards the end, when they put the call out. And they were talking about, and they wrote stories, and they had been undefeated, summer swimming isn't the most competitive, but they've been undefeated for like 8 years in a row. You know what his goal was? To have every kid that comes out fall in love with swimming. That was his goal. I'm going to have every kid fall in love with swimming. To me, that was pretty amazing, because if every kid falls in love with swimming, what's going to happen with the kid that's got good genes? They're going to like it, and they're going to go really fast. And what's going to happen to the kids that aren't so good? They're probably going to like it and kind of tag along and get a little faster because the other kids are there. So everybody sort of contributes to go forward. So I always remember that. It's such a moving story for me. My goal is to get every kid to love swimming. And sometimes at the elite level, we don't think about that. And we were talking earlier today. I had some grants from the National Wrestling Coaches Association. We don't have government involved in sport funding at all, unfortunately. So it's all private. And they got like 3 people to write $100,000 checks to do this coaching education program. They were all former college wrestlers. They weren't the starters. Second team guys that hung on in college, and worked really hard, learned a lot, and then they went to Wall Street and made $200 million, $500 million, and now they attribute the sport to, changing their life. So I tell these college coaches, because college wrestling coaching is very competitive, you never know when you got that guy in your room that could be a titan of Wall Street. And in America, a lot of college programs go off donations from alums. So I'm going, so yeah, you want to be really competitive, but you might also want to be thinking about how can I have everybody have a pretty good experience. I've had other people say, hey, the guy didn't end up a titan of Wall Street. He ended up a high school coach, a very successful high school coach, who sent me all his best kids, 2 of whom became All-Americans. So that whole idea of sort of, paying it forward. Okay, let's talk about some of these others. Why should you help young players develop their mental games and how to do it? Let me skip a couple here. Okay, so why should we help? I think, typically, why do we want kids to develop their mental games?
In the end, I think that's where the difference is made.
Okay, yeah, very practically. The higher you go up in sport, the more the physical stuff cancels out. And it's who can do it when it counts. It's not like, we had a famous quote from kind of a crazy baseball player. What percentage of sport is physical versus mental? And he had, it was like 90% physical and 100% mental. I go, I like his math, but his point is you need it all. Okay, why else do we want to teach kids mental skills?
I think the mental skills are very much the skills that they will also use in their later life, and it's one of the things that will help them prevail in later life also.
Yeah.
So I think it's quite obviously it's really important when you're in the top. It will be very decisive, but for those, they gotta love swimming, man.
Yeah.
I mean, it's the same thing. If they learn the mental skills, they will take that with them from the sports to their later life and will inspire others to start sports. We need those young people to come in. And
For sport or for other endeavors. So if a kid learns through sailing how to persevere, how to read the wind, how to deal with a lot of different things, then later in life, hey, I'm reading the markets, I'm reading, these skills can help. It's not a panacea, but it can do it. Okay? One that I always think of is that we haven't mentioned, it's easier to start players off on the right foot mentally than try to repair them later on. As a sports psych person, the worst call you want is, come quick, we're in a mess. Because it's like, well, the first thing I tell them is, we have a very low probability of, I don't do miracles. If I did, you probably couldn't afford me. Because, sometimes you do get lucky. So I won't say, sometimes you give it a whirl, but I try to be realistic. I go, hey, I'm not a miracle worker. This is a last ditch chance. We'll try some things. One second. But, a lot of kids that you run into have problems later. Something happened when they were a kid. Like I deal with a tennis player. Her dad, who she loves dearly, was so critical with her. She's got confidence problems today. She's a perfectionist that eats herself alive, but a very accomplished athlete. But her dad, didn't know and just was always on her case. So if we could have trained the dad to back off a little, probably could have helped her. Yes, sir.
Just a comment to your previous slide, also reading this now. I think this approach is very common in sport, that psychological work is to repair some things that the athletes lack or they cannot cope with. But as you said earlier on, also we have physical skills, we have a specific sport skill, but mental skills as well is at the same level. So of course we need to practice them as well to build up the full athlete. As some said here, that later on they need them to perform at the highest level. But if we don't see mental skills the same way as we do with physical skills that are obvious to see a development, then we'll not have a complete athlete. Then we'll go to this approach and try to repair.
Yeah. And I could give you 2 examples. I worked for, about 10, 12 years with pair skating, figure skating, ice dance, and I worked with freestyle mogul skiing. And I used to fly in because they were in a different part of the country, like monthly. And the athletes on the skating had to pay. They had to pay. It wasn't, the federation wasn't paying for me to come in. They'd all chip in. And what was interesting is the better athletes would come in, would see me more regularly and say something like, we don't have big problems right now, because in pair skating you get a lot of, it's really hard. They're there 8 hours today, they bicker, you know, a lot of things happen. But they'd say, you know, we don't have any big problems right now, so I want to make sure we don't. I want to do some preventative. The ones that only came in when they had big problems, and what I'd find is over time, and it wasn't just about me making money off them, that wasn't it at all, but what would happen is the ones who kind of said, it's like preventative medicine. I'm going to eat right, I'm going to exercise, I'm going to take care of myself. The long haul, you're healthier. Then I beat myself up and they fix me later. It's not a whole lot different. So that's one to remember, like how do we start the kids off? If you're coaching the 18 and above, what sport?
Swimming.
Swimming. You should be really concerned of what's going on in the pools from 6 to 18. Because if they screw it up, guess who's going to inherit the problems?
I know.
Yeah.
In my perspective, I think educating the parents
Yep.
in getting them off on the right foot is really important, because like you said, the parents don't see their kid making something wrong. They see that the coach doing something wrong, or everybody else. It's not my kid. So I think that we could start the kids off on a good foot, on the right foot, if you by educating the parents. I don't know how you get to the parents. I don't work with that age group, but I do see a lot of parental influence, and I do see a lot of pushing the kid and say, yeah, you're good, you're good, you're good. So the kid will never look at themselves as being anything but the best.
Yep. You hit a couple things there. If you're at the elite level, you should be concerned with this. We did a lot of work with the U.S. Olympic Committee, and when we found out what factors interfered with performance. Parents were either a source of support and friends or a distraction. Women's soccer, one of the first Olympics they did, they went and had 2 parents elected to represent all the other parents, and they had people they could talk to in the staff. Other parents wouldn't go in. So in other words, they had a parent support system worked out. If you got a beef, go to these people. They address it with the coach. A high school basketball coach in the U.S. We were interviewing him a couple of years ago, and he told us, how do you get them to do it? When the girls make the team, they don't get their uniform unless a parent comes in and has a meeting with me and the girl. They don't get a uniform, they don't play. So, and then he says, we talk about roles, we talk about expectations, she gets the uniform. I kind of thought that was really an interesting way, because I don't have time to go. Well, your daughter isn't going to play and get a uniform until you show up sometime.
I reverse it. But I work, of course, with a higher age group. I don't deal with parents, which is not true. And yet I do.
Yep.
But that's the first statement.
Yep.
And usually they get shocked a little bit, like, hey, what's this? But it works quite well to kind of make them aware of, okay, where is my parent coming to the play and where not?
Yep. And a lot of the sports we're working with now, when parents sign their kid up, they get a little one-page brochure, starting your kid out right in sport. Here are some guidelines. Then when the kid goes up a level, there's another little set of, and sometimes it's very difficult to get parents in a room today. So we're doing more online, because no excuse you can't do it. It's online and you print a certificate and bring it in. Okay, so there's different ways to approach this now, but the whole idea of having a progressive system that as a parent gets more experience with the kid in sport, the level of parent education kind of goes up. Unique things, U.S. figure skating used to do a thing where at the nationals, again, senior level, they have a parent advisory committee. So back in the day, you'd have a great skater like Olympic champion Christy Yamaguchi, Paul Wiley. These people's parents would be at the nationals and offer advice for parents coming up. Now, of course, they picked the parents. They didn't pick the parent from hell to be on the committee. You know what I mean? Type thing. So, yeah, so that's exactly right. Okay, and this is really important that it's kids, how do we, lack of a better word, grow good athletes? Well, they grow in this ecosystem, an ecosystem of coaches, parents, peers. In tennis, we saw sometimes when we get sort of a cohort, a group of boys, and they all compete together, and they sort of rise up and you get a better performance. And sometimes you don't, it's sort of luck, but it's sort of a mixture. If you're on a team and the kids all are smoking grass all the time, and you don't want that occurring. Some teams, that's sort of my son's high school teams, it was drinking, drove me crazy. It was
Snowboarding, the grass would work.
yeah. Yeah, I worked with freestyle skiing. So you know, those kind of things we want the system. The more we can align the system, the better we go. And parents are part of the system, players, spouses when you get to the older. Okay?
Can I ask you a question?
No. No, of course you can.
How do we secure that the kids have to fall once or twice to learn how it hurts, right?
Mm-hmm.
So how do we balance this out, that they don't fall too many times?
Oh, really,
Because this is
I knew I didn't want you to ask this question.
Yeah?
I knew I didn't want you to ask this question because it was a hard one. No, but the question's a good one, is you're trying to find sort of the sweet spot of,
They learn from falling,
they learn from falling, but one, you don't want to get them hurt.
right?
And two, you know, like I said with the tennis example I gave a while back, they don't want the kids losing 60% of the time and only winning 40. That's not good for motivation. So in some ways, you're trying to architect an environment or through drills or activities that, like, you know, easy for me to say because I don't have to do it, but sort of making a mental note. When I do that activity, the kids complete it about 70% of the time. When I do this one, that's a notch up. So kind of an environmental engineering and maybe kind of tracking that some. And then it's always an individual read on a kid. And trying to individualize practice in a team setting is hard. But like, how are we going to do that? I don't have a magic answer, unfortunately. Anybody got an easy question? See, I told the guy with the glasses. Remember I said guys with glasses look smart. So, you see?
I think, isn't it a thing about the expectations you meet the child with and what challenge you put up with it? I mean, the bigger challenge, the bigger expectation, the bigger the fall.
Yep.
I mean, that's how to cope with it, maybe.
Yeah, it's sort of, you're trying to manipulate the, one I think is, again, I always try to be realistic with you guys and gals, and I don't know the constraints you're under and how much help you have, but I think we could improve a lot in monitoring coaching, like just in drills. Like I know the average success rate for this drill is, and I know I can ratchet it up, and that usually happens. I can ratchet it down, that happens. Now, you're not always in a situation to do that, but sometimes just a lot of research now shows coaches learn through experience and reflecting on the experience. So as a coach, easy for me to say, maybe a lot of you do this already, but I spend 15 minutes after every practice, you know, at an appropriate time, and record the lessons I learned in that practice. And I put it in a book. Lessons I did well today, things, you know, the do's and don'ts. I'm not, and maybe it's kid specific. With this kid, Jacob, I'm not doing this ever again. You know, whatever it might be. So the other is, as you two guys were talking here, kind of helping each other, a lot of research now coming out. Wade Gilbert's done a lot of work with communities of practice that, again, we don't do. The more coaches can learn from each other. So if we took 5 of you in a similar situation and we put up, how, you know, like just what you said, how do I ensure that they fall but not too much? And everybody spent 15, 20 minutes talking about it, had a beer, pizza, whatever you have here. Then it turns into an hour, and sort of record. And I think a lot of people are finding if you can figure out how to structure that, it's hard with schedules. Sometimes it's across sports. You know, a swimming coach and a handball coach, people wouldn't normally put them together, but you do, then all of a sudden things start cooking. So really good example. Great. Okay, what we're going to do at this juncture, because I've gone, did they need a break, you think? Or okay, he said you didn't need a break, but I'm going to give you one. How long do they get?
10 minutes.
10-minute break. But first, stand up and do this. Stand up. Clap your hands 3 times. I knew I could get a standard ovation before the break. Okay, a couple things. Thanks for coming back. I'm always happy when people come back, as long as they're not coming towards me.
We need to do the standing thing again?
Yeah, no, that's a little later. I do have a handout I put together. I wanted to give it, I meant to give it earlier and I forgot, but it just, it's something we did for a tennis chapter, but it takes not the exact ages we did here, but characteristics of kids at all the different ages. So there's one going around for everybody. So you can just take that, and this might be useful for you. The other thing I want to remind you at the end, if anybody wants to know more about our institute, I have these up here at the end. I really appreciated the people came up at break and talked with me. A couple good examples came up. One, we were talking about reflection. I think we know getting kids to reflect is important. But if you ask a kid, like, you know, a lot of times, well, what do you think? What kind of answer do you get? What's that? I don't know. I don't know. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know. You need to sometimes teach them how to reflect. So think of it as a developmental progression. Like an old professor at my university who I just loved, an exercise physiologist many years ago, told me this story. His daughters would come home and they'd sit at the dinner table, you know, pre-computer age, and he said, "What'd you learn at school today?" And they'd go, "Nothing." So that's what they said the first night. And then the next night, "What'd you learn at school today?" "Nothing." So I like the way they approach this. So the third day they come, "What'd you learn at school today?" "Nothing." He said, "Okay, so after dinner, I'm going to have everybody go in the next room and open the encyclopedia and read for a half hour because you didn't learn anything at school today." And he made them do it. And then he goes, and the fourth day when he asked what they learned in school, he got reports. And I always think of that. So sometimes we have to hold kids accountable. So, okay, nothing. Okay, well, I kind of might have caught you off guard. Tomorrow, I want you to write 3 things down. And if you write three things down, we're going to do this fun thing. You know, I mean, it depends on your coaching style, or we'll do not such a fun thing. But just sort of teaching them to reflect. When you teach, they often teach you wait time. If you ask students, like, does anybody have a question? To wait like 10, 20, 30 seconds. Because they might be thinking or they might be shy, that type of thing. You know, after 10 minutes, you probably want to move on. But sometimes we need to teach them. The other, we were talking about maybe overprotective parents. And, you know, over-involved parents. And that can be always tricky, but one example came up in it is sometimes it's hard to deal with parents when you have the issue on the court, in the pool, or at the field that day. So the more you can do preemptively. So you might go, I gave an example, if parents are not letting their kids be independent enough. Maybe you have a meeting with the parents and you go, how many want your kids to be independent when they grow up, and you list these things, and they're probably all going to raise their hand. How many of you love your kids and would do anything for your kid? Probably all going to raise their hand. Okay, this creates a problem because sometimes these conflict. You love your kid so much you can't. How many does it hurt you when you watch them fail? Anybody who's been a parent, the worst thing is watching your kid fail. So kind of maybe educating them at the front end. However, how many want your kids to learn how to overcome failure in life? So then you sort of give a rationale. So when we run practices sometimes, I don't allow, I'll use tennis, I don't allow parents to come on the court once practice starts. And my rationale is I want your child to be more independent. Or if they forget their racket, once you might help them out, but if it's more than twice, have them come without a racket. Because they'll remember their racket next time, but if you're always bringing their racket to them. So sometimes you can, if you can preemptively kind of think of the problems you're going to have, talk about how you might deal with them at the, so then when they come up, you can sort of get around them. It's the worst to try to deal with it on the fly. The parents in, the ear on the court or whatever it is in your ear. Okay, just being aware of time here, a couple other things I want to hit. We were talking about, why we want athletes to learn mental skills. Well, again, on the pitch versus off the pitch, you need athletes to perform well in both settings. I'm going to skip a few things. We want them to be successful in life. We talked about that. Sometimes we talk about the 3 Ps of sport participation. Our outcomes: performance. Don't have to be ashamed of that. Coaches love performance. Sometimes when I talk to youth development people, they just don't get it. Like they go, sport's a vehicle to teach all these other things, which I actually believe it is. But I go, but they didn't grow up as coaches. A coach finds a beautiful tack in sailing as a beautiful thing in itself. A jump shot, a certain wrestling move. A sport person thinks that is like, you don't need to justify that. That is sort of like perfection. And sometimes the youth development people don't get that. And so for performance for us is important. Participation. Again, you want people in your sport to participate for a lifetime. And if you don't have that altruistic motive, you want them to buy tickets and be a fan or watch TV and tune in your sport. Personal development. We've talked about that. Okay, a couple things real quick on mental skills training. This is from a friend of mine, Sean McCann, who's a really experienced sports psychologist. Probably been to 12 Olympics now. This is a little older slide. And he came up with 10 rules of mental training. Mental training can't replace physical training. We're not saying it can. You got to do your reps. You got to put in the miles, yardage, whatever, the number of shots. Physical training and physical ability are not enough to succeed consistently. We've all had the physical specimen, and she or he, the hit or miss. Oops, sorry. A strong mind, I love this one, may not win an Olympic medal, but a weak mind will lose you one. Okay? Because I could have the strongest mind here, but I might not have the right gene set. And Michael Phelps is a great athlete. I interviewed him one time for a couple hours for a business thing. He was impressive, but I've seen athletes with much better mental credentials. I'm not saying he was bad, but like Bonnie Blair, the great speed skater, was one of the most impressive people I ever thought mentally. Michael Phelps has a big engine. He's got fins for feet. He jumps off. How much advantage does he get at the start if he has a good one? He's underwater till about the time to turn. Some people have the horsepower that just make them great. Okay, so we got to be realistic with that. Coaches frequently don't know what their athletes are thinking. And sometimes I'll do an exercise and you'll come up with all these things versus, well, did you ask them? When I've gone to the Olympics or junior nationals or some big event, I'll tell the coaches, do you know what your athlete's mental preparation routine is? If you know what it is, now if they're inconsistent and all over, you might want to help them change it. But if you know what it is and you know they don't want to talk before the event, maybe you shouldn't be coaching them up. If you know they want to listen to music, you know, again, that's, some of that goes with self-regulation. If somebody's all over the place, you might want to intervene. But if you know they swim or perform or race or shoot or whatever it is well when they do this, then you can help them by knowing what to do. Okay? Thoughts affect behavior. Consistency of thinking gives you consistency of performance or behavior. Okay, so you know, that's, well, I'm a huge believer in mental preparation routines. When I do a one-time workshop, I'll always do that. If you can get, we've got a whole bunch of research. Top athletes screw their head on physically and mentally the same way every event. They don't psych up more for the Olympic finals. Now, the trouble is, when you're in the Olympic finals, is it's awful hard to stay in your routine because there's all these distractions, you know, and there's all kind of, it's a circus. Okay, the skater I was telling you about, the, you know, Bonnie Blair, the great American speed skater from many years ago. I mean, when she does talk, she brings her medals in a suitcase. There's so many. But she goes, she had one of the best quotes ever. Being at the Olympics is like being a kid at the candy store. The secret is to eat some candy, but not so much you get a stomachache. And if you go to big events, it's how do I, you know, you don't want to go into a bunker because you don't normally do that, but you don't want to get so distracted and be a tourist that you're not on a business trip. At high level, I know I'm talking Olympics, but a high level Olympic performance, sometimes I say it's like I take a 10-year-old and we go to Disney World and we stay in the hotel coaches can't afford. And we open the thing and say, okay, go ahead and do your homework now. I mean, in some ways, big events are sort of like that. And figuring out how to have enough of a routine that's still some fun and some other things. How this pertains to young athletes, hopefully kids are developing, you know, how do you learn a routine? Some of it's trial and error. You got to go out and psych up too much, clown around too much. Now, as a coach, I want that trial and error to be pretty quick. And then over time, I may have to change my routine up. Golfers sometimes talk about, Dick Coop, great mental training consultant for golf, talked about swing cues, a word that you might use. And he goes, sometimes you just need to freshen a cue up. It got stale. So even though you have a routine, you need something a little different to kind of change up a little. Coaches often have a different view of changing technical mistakes versus mental mistakes. Technical mistake, we set up a practice, etc. A mental mistake, figure it out. Well, set up a practice. Coaches must be involved in the mental training process. Sending people, in my experience is a sports psych can help a person. But boy, if I have the best consults I've ever had over the years is I'm working with a coach, I'm working with a player, and sometimes some other people. Everybody in the system's on the same page. Sometimes it's okay to force athletes to take time to do mental training. Sometimes people in mental training, it's a little bit like, well, they have to like me to come and do it. But when they go to the weight room, nobody takes a vote. Hey, we're doing fitness now. How many want to go today? Oh, you didn't like it? I once worked with a baseball coach who was really good, and I didn't like using physical activity as a punisher, but some of the guys came late and weren't very respectful at our mental training meeting. So they all got up the next week at 6 in the morning and ran for 5 days. And, you know, I go, well, I don't like the idea of physical activity as a punisher. But if they did other things as a team, that was the punishment. So I took that as a real compliment. Because he was saying mental training is like everything else we do. And that's what we do when people don't take mental training serious. So sometimes I think, you know, we want people to like it, and relationships really important in what we do. But there's another side of me, it's like going to school. And sometimes you have to do stuff that isn't as fun. And you got to give it a chance. Like any other skill, mental skills need to be measured to try to maximize performance. Coaches need to think about their own mental skills. We just did a study on emotions with high school basketball players, and they learn a lot about what emotions are and how to handle them from playing high school basketball. But a big part of it, they read their coach. Like I remember a quote from one girl we interviewed. I knew my coach was really mad after that game. But I was really impressed that he went in and didn't yell at everybody. She goes, I knew he was really mad, but he didn't yell. And she remembered that. That, okay, how did he manage those emotions at that time? And this was a girls' team, and we knew from talking to the coach, he said, if I start yelling at him, it falls apart. But he was really mad, but she saw that kind of self-regulation in him. Okay, just some thoughts there. I'm going to skip a few things here because there's a couple things just for time. Wanted to make sure we hit this one. And I know you've talked some about it, but it's like, who's responsible for mental skills training? Who's the single most important person for mental skills training?
The athlete.
Yeah, exactly, the athlete. They got to be open to it or try it. But then you have the coach. If, depending on the level, you might have a sports psych person involved or a mental training person. You got the parents. You got a senior, if it's an academy, you got senior people modeling things to, the research you've done here shows in academies that elite athletes feel an obligation to mentor the younger athletes. You get a system where everybody belongs. Siblings, a lot of our studies on the factors related to psychological development of Olympic champions, their siblings had an influence. Sometimes the girls trained with an older brother. Or the sibling was there helping. We talked a lot about parents. Some of our research with professional tennis players and, again, Olympic champions, you can be a parent from hell and get your kid on the medal stand. We found that. Usually there's some baggage that the kid has. Yeah. Usually there's some baggage that the kid has from doing that, maybe burnout, other kind of things that might come from that. Okay, see if that comes back. Good. Coaching, a lot of research has come out the last few years on what they call autonomy supportive coaching. This relates to what they call self-determination theory. Great coaching point works at any age level. This theory says people have three basic needs: autonomy, competence, and relatedness. Autonomy, sort of being able to control your own destiny a little bit. Competence, who woke up this morning? Anybody here wake up this morning? I want to feel like a bag of manure. Nobody does. Everybody wants to feel competent. And usually as social beings, we want some relatedness. Now, it may not always be 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. But I tell business executives, if you want to motivate a team, if every week you went in the office and you said, what can I do this week to increase my direct reports' autonomy? What can I do to increase their relatedness? And what can I do to increase their competence? You probably would have pretty motivated people. But what happens is coaches like yourselves, are so busy. You're pulled in so many directions. A lot of times, you thought about that when we were here today. And then, when your team's not motivated, it might come back. But sort of kind of getting in the habit of thinking that. But a lot of research is coming out now. How often do you let your kids have, or your athletes have input into decisions? If they're 9 and 10, how much input do you give them? Very little. What kind of input could give if they're 9 and 10? You're going to ask them open-ended questions like, what do you want to do today?
Choices. This or this.
Yeah, you give them multiple choice. Hey, we got 3 things we could do today. A, this drill. B, this drill. C, this drill. You got 1 minute to decide. The clock is running. Tick, 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 tick. Okay, what is it? Can't decide? Okay, I'll pick C. Let's go. Then next time they'll decide. All right, so again, it's, you know, a 16-year-old, a 17-year-old, hey, I want you to help me design practice. Let's start thinking what would work, or this element of it. Okay, provide sometimes it's just providing a rationale. One thing we picked up from the coaches we've interviewed, we're just analyzing that data from the Gen Z study. The other thing they said, in America anyways, today's athlete needs a rationale. They need a why. And there's some research to show that kids don't sort of just buy into authority. And given what's happened in Washington now, they may never buy into authority. So they don't buy into it automatically. So as you know, 40 years ago, you were a coach and they might have just listened to you because you were the coach. Now you might be a great coach, but you may need to tell them why that drill is important without giving them a big lecture. Okay? And consider player perspectives and feelings, sometimes just given their input at an age-appropriate way. Decrease controlling coaching. A lot of literature pointing to that now. Coercive coaching. I think one of the tricky things here is you got to maintain control. Kids need to be disciplined sometimes. So I'm not saying that we don't discipline kids. You know, you've got to have managed kids. You know, you're clear in the guidelines. If they violate it, they go to your jail a little bit or whatever to deal with it. But other than that, sometimes we, using a lot of guilt. Okay, once in a while you might use it to get a kid over a hurdle, but if you're using guilt a lot with your kids, you're probably kind of weakening their psychological profile long term. Okay, constantly pressuring. It's tricky because in some sports like figure skating or tennis, if you're at the higher levels, your income is a couple players. And if they leave, your income's gone. And if they don't produce, their parents are going to switch coaches. That's sort of the reality sometimes of junior sport up. So, how do you pressure? When do you pressure? How much? You don't want to fall into the trap of just pressuring all the time. You're probably going to weaken your athlete long term. So somebody was talking at the break how important it is to have your philosophy figured out as a coach. This is what I believe in, this type of thing, etc., and go forward. Okay, just being aware of time. I just thought this was important. How do young athletes develop their mental games? Some of it's trial and error. If a young runner is trying to figure out how to psych up for a meet and they're, 14, they might need to go in and be under-psyched one time and over-psyched the next and sort of figure it out. Now, there's ways that you can give them feedback to kind of be more systematic to make that trial and error quicker. We've done that a lot. Like, okay, how do you think you'd like to try? Well, here's what you think you need to do. Try it. How did that work? Okay, let's go that way. Just mental prep. I'll just give you. I've done this with like junior high kid, 13, 14 up. We have 3 mental preparation plans. Plan A is everything's going fine and this is my routine. Plan B is we arrived late and I have a hurry up routine. I know what stretches I'm going to do. I know I'm going to change in the car. I know I'm not going to have my normal 30 minutes. I know how to get ready in 10. And plan C is we had lightning, or we had a delay, or an injured skier down the course. And now I got to stretch my routine. When kids get, those upper levels, actually having those three kind of routines is pretty important. Modeling, I mentioned that before. They're going to learn from you, from the other kids in the program or athletes. And that's kind of also with social comparison. A competitor will always suck other people in. And as coaches, we want competitors, but there's sometimes we don't. And if somebody's always got to be first and is, kind of taking the, you want to, maybe you're doing some type of physical training where you don't want to max. And somebody's always got to be first, and all of a sudden he's got the whole group going too fast. Experiencing and learning how to deal with adversity and failure. And I'll say more about that in a minute. To me, this is sort of a big area. A lot of literature's coming out. We've got to help kids learn how to fail. Okay, Gen Z stuff, but just in general. And it goes back to your question, the dosage. I know they need to fall to learn, but boy, if they're falling all the time, they're going to be a wreck, or they could get hurt, or other sorts of things. Reflection's a big one. I already mentioned that, but getting kids to spend, I had a great high school baseball coach. I was terrible, never played, so I sat with him on the bench quite a bit. To this day, he's the best, and he and I still talk. But I learned so much about the psychology of excellence from him by sitting there talking with him the games. And he'd get me to reflect on stuff. Well, why do you think we did that, Dan? Well, I don't know. I was 16. Well, think about it. Talk to me tomorrow. Okay? Through stages of development that I talked about, like through time, your ability to reflect will increase some. Okay, I'm going to skip a few things here. Sorry. But there's one part I thought you'd be interested in. This was a project we did with this wrestling coach, and from what I've been told, I feel pretty comfortable with this group. I'm always leery of presenting this project because you can, in the hands of poor coaches, you can mess up a lot of Danish kids if you do what this guy does. Okay, so you got to be a pretty on top of it coach. This guy's name's Jay Robinson. He's done these summer intensive wrestling camps for 40 years. Now, he's a former Olympian. He's won national championships, got coach of the year. He's got all these. He's retired now. But for 40 years, he ran these summer intensive camps because he didn't think kids knew how to train hard. Former Army Ranger, Special Forces. And this whole thing is sort of Army Ranger meets positive youth development. It's sort of weird. If you first meet him, you think the old drill sergeant appeared from yesteryear. And then if you listen to him, he's like autonomy coaching. Like always talking about kids. Well, it's your decision to go now or quit. It's up to you. So it's a real interesting blend. But we did a big extensive study of his camps. We went in and measured kids psychologically before the camp, after the camp, 9 months later, and found significant effects on psychological development. We interviewed kids. We've done a bunch of research. Of any coach I've ever met, he's probably got the best thought out philosophy. There's not a thing this guy doesn't do that he can't tell you why he does it. And he's a coach. So he's talked about, he's run these camps for 40 years, and he goes, yeah, these wrestlers are my guinea pigs and my white lab rats. And I'd do things in the camp, and I'd held it constant. Then the next year, I'd try to do different things. So he said, over time, he's really got this figured out pretty well. So let me just quickly this is an intensive camp, which in many ways probably overtrains the kid. But these kids are coming in the summer just to get better. So he's not doing a year training program. He wouldn't do this. This is their normal thing. They either come 14 or 28 days. It's voluntary. The kids come. They pay for it. I mean, this is a very successful business. For 2 weeks, it's $1,500, including room and board, $3,000 for 28 days. He runs about 225 kids a camp, about 5 camps a summer. 6:30 a.m. wake up. 6:45 to 7:30 weights and running. Breakfast, technique, and that's not like light technique, you're working. Lunch, hard training. Dinner, mental attitude. Oh, and then we'll finish with weights or running. And then lights out. And this is for 14 or 28 days. With some variation. So from a physiology perspective, forget it, because it's all about teaching the kids these mental skills. Over the years, he's come up, his wife dubbed it, his name's Jay Robinson, the J7. He's defined, I teach kids discipline, sacrifice, dedication, hard work, responsibility, accountability, service. And what's interesting is If you ask him, he'll say, I teach accountability this way. I teach service that way. He's got this pretty figured out. I just wanted to share with you a few things because of time, but his curriculum to get you thinking about a coach.
Can you just explain service to me? That's the word I didn't know.
Service would be like community service. For example, I told some people earlier, he wanted the kids, and he's a great example of a guy who, he didn't have all these when he started. Over the years, he's developed it. And he had somebody in to talk to the kids about giving back to the community. And he said, you know, I don't do that, and I don't teach them about it. So he added service. And he's dealing with 15 and 16-year-old, mostly boys, some girls. And he said, I want to teach them empathy, to care for others. So at night they come into the camp, and I don't know when, but they have a little free time, and they can get a snack before bed. And of course, he sells the snacks, and they buy it, and they he says, if you put your change in this jar, I'll double it at the end of camp, whatever you have in there. And then what they do at the end of the camp, they have kids in Latin America that have like cleft palate, deformed. And then the money goes to pay for doctors who go there, a nonprofit, to fix it. And then he shows the kids a before and after picture. But he said he does that because in this age group, even though they're older, he says 15-year-old boys don't get empathy as well as I'd like. So what I do is when they see the picture of the deformed face and then they see it fixed, they sort of make the connection that my money changed this. And I just go, man, that just hit me as pretty brilliant. At one time being 15 or 16 and kind of dense, I go, I might have got that. It wasn't too abstract type of thing, okay? During we observed a 14-day camp. He did like 5 40 to 60-minute talks, and he talks about, he just goes on, oh, I wish I had him here. I'm going to give you the answers to the test, because I made all the mistakes that you guys are going to make, but I'm going to give you the answers now. If you're smart, you'll take them. If not, you'll make the same mistakes I did. And then he'll go on and have all these stories. And like, I set goals, and he talks about going out west and roping wild horses in the national parks and just doing stuff. He's pretty charismatic, but they also have themes. He does mini presentations, like in the middle of the day, he'll see something, 10 minutes on discipline, because somebody wasn't disciplined. Reflective journaling. They have a journal every night before bed they have to write in their journal. Daily relaxation imagery sessions, we were talking about this earlier. He's got a really gruff voice, 220 kids out in the mat. Relax. But every day they do the relaxation. Practice positive, negative, and neutrals. In practice, you get so many points, and there's you pay all this money for the camp. You don't get a I did it shirt unless you have so many points. And you get points, you start with 1,000, and you lose points for some of them are hygiene based. Wrestling, it's hotter than heck in the summer in the US. If you don't wear a clean shirt, you lose points. If your water bottle's not filled, you lose points. If you don't show up on time, you lose points. And then you can earn some positives. They're a lot harder, but if a counselor notices you did something really extraordinary. And then there's some neutrals. Okay. Quote of the day, or thought of the day. I mean, just little things. The kids wake up in camp and they go into the, first thing you do, you go to the bathroom. They sit down on the you-know-what, they shut the door, and there's a quote of the day to read for the day about what it was something in camp. Okay? Navy, they have a U.S. Navy SEAL come in and talk about dealing with adversity. They have physical challenges, like they'll do the U.S. Navy SEAL swim test. And these guys aren't swimmers, and he goes, anybody want to try? They get them in the pool and see if they could qualify. Coach, counselor, feedback, reinforcement discussions. This is that point system I mentioned. And these kids, this I did it shirt is sort of legendary in the U.S. wrestling community. Kids really covet those shirts. And if you're 1 point short and you're a really good kid, you don't get the shirt. Because he says, in life, it's like that. If you're 1 point short, if you're 1 minute late, the plane isn't waiting for you. And so, so there's a lot of, I'd say, tough love in here in the sense of there's standards, and he's going, you got to hit the standards and that type of thing. Now, he says if you went to a regular high school, you'd make kids crazy with this. These kids are pretty motivated that come, but some of them struggle. But he's highly intentional in terms of his teaching and mental skills, has a well-developed system for implementing his philosophy and objectives. The vast majority of his coaching behaviors were linked to his philosophy. Almost all of his coaching behaviors were linked to his philosophy. We observed this, but he seemed to have, he says, I'm trying to build habits in the kids. And the more we talked to him, the more we came up with this system. He's always talking to the kids about the individual understands that behavior has consequences. So he goes, all your behaviors have consequences. Doing your homework, listening to your parents, not training for wrestling, training for wrestling. The individual takes responsibility. So a big thing is you got to take responsibility for your behavior. If your roommate lost your key to the room, it's your responsibility. He's your roommate, it's not mine. So he's tough that way. The individual makes a choice to change his or her behavior. So you better double check to make sure your roommate and you have the system squared away. The individual produces a change in his or her behavior, so we double check regularly. Continuation of the behavior traits creates a new habit. The habitual change leads to positive consequences. He feels this is how kids learn. That's his system, okay? The way it works is this kind of crazy, but that's the system here. This cylinder is sort of that 14 days of camp. So we go from day 1 out to 14. And what he does is he's constantly talking about these habits, but he has a different topic like discipline and then responsibility. You can't see this one, but stress management. So his camp is designed at the first he's talking about what I have, discipline. He defines it, talks about it, gets them talking about it. He's constantly coming back to it. Then they shift to responsibility. And he says he reads the kids. Somebody was talking about reading kids earlier. And sometimes one's longer, one's shorter, but he goes through the whole camp that way. So I'm going to stop there at that point because I want to leave some time for questions. A couple things why I wanted to get to that last one, to give you some ideas. This guy is a master. I can't say how much I've learned from him. He's done it a long time. He really gets kids of this age group. It's not for everybody. I'm not sure other people could replicate it the same because, he's won all these national championships. He's got a lot of charisma he brings in. But I think if other coaches modeled a lot of those curricular things, you could get some changes in your kids. He runs a whole summer camp for it. It's a business. He has time to do that. You may not. But what I'd recommend is you say, okay, which of those could I consistently do with my team, with my kids? Okay, I'm only going to pick 3. But I always tell coaches, if you're going to do goal setting, think of the busiest time of year after you lost 2 games that week. And are you going to have the goal setting meeting when your defense stinks? Probably should set some goals for defense maybe, so whatever you commit to, you want to follow through and make sure you're consistent or you talk a good game and don't deliver. Kids learn by doing, so the more you can make these experiential activities, like he'll bring these kids to failure. He wants them all to fail in camp. And they talk a lot about, you're running against a wall, you're running along a wall, the door's not open. Most people quit. Running, the door will be open. You keep running, the door's not open, so you break it down. And then he'll have other things like get 1% better every day. Just little things, and the kids remember these quotes. He had one we were talking at lunch or on the car on the way in, bullying. I go, where's he going with this? A wrestler is a lot like a sheepdog. I go, where is he going? A sheepdog? What do sheepdogs do? Now, none of these kids, they don't live on farms, so they protect the flock of sheep. So you're at school. A wrestler is a warrior. You're the sheepdog. So what are you going to do if some poor little sheep is getting bullied on? You're going to walk by or do nothing, or you're going to stop and say something? Now, again, maybe it's just me, but I'm going back to a 15, 16-year-old kid. I go, I would get the sheepdog. Now, I would add, that doesn't mean you do a double leg takedown and beat up the kid that's doing the bullying in a non-violent way, but the idea that he's sending a message that, hey, wrestlers, if we want to think of ourselves as warriors like the military, we protect the country. And in school, there are some kids, which is a pretty darn important message, because a lot of contact sport athletes tend to be less moral, and they tend to have moral disengagement. I was a contact sport athlete. And we need to really work on that, that you don't bully people. You don't do other things, and again, saying some of that. So, but that story, he had a lot of great stories like that he'd get the kids to remember. So I'm 1 minute over, so I better stop here, but can I hang around and answer questions? Yeah. Okay, I can, but I didn't know if you'd let me. So quick question here, if you need to go. I'm used to people leaving when I speak, so it won't bother me. I'm resilient, it's just part of my adversity training. These jokes are funny in America. Could you translate it to Danish for me? Maybe that's my problem today. Any questions? No? Okay, if anybody has one at the end, come up. If you want an institute brochure, I'm hawking them because I don't want to carry them back home in my bag. Have a great day, and thank you.